स्वाध्याय टीवी। डॉक्टर बाबा साहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी।
Namaskar. Welcome again in the session of unit costing, which is a part of a cost accounting. We already discussed the theoretical part in the last session, where we discussed the what is unit costing, definitions, meaning, the characteristics of unit costing, and most important part of the how the actually elements of cost affected to the unit costing. So when the manufacturer are willing to know that the cost of products and the cost of the particular manufacturing process, at that point of time they are willing to know that how the cost has been designed and which way the cost of product can be identified. So for that we discussed the format of the cost structure also in the last session, and how the cost of product and the cost of manufacturing process can be determined, that would be easily identified. Here now in this session onwards, we will actually try to resolve the problems, find out the solution of the problems, and we will discuss the one by one a different method of a problems for searching and find out the cost of the manufacturing product and the process of the manufacturing product. So in that way we need to identify and we need to understand how the whole cost structure has been actually identified, and the cost structures would be helpful to determine the product value and the product cost, which would be helpful to actually find out the sales value, as well as you can determine the profitability of the particular product. So here we will discuss the part of the cost structures and as well as the how it would be distributed and divided the elements of cost in a different segments and differentiations. So like in that way we were already discussed in the last session that there are certain parts of the cost structures that begins with the first is material consumed, and at the end of the material consumed we will identify the answer, the how much raw material has been consumed in the particular first part of the cost structures. Then we will identify the direct expenditures which would be added into the cost sheet, and we will find out the second answer, that is prime cost. Then added the factory expenses and factory overheads on the prime cost, and we will identify what is the work cost of the particular manufacturing process. And then next is we will identify the administrative cost and the office overheads. Office overheads would be added into that work cost, and will be identified the cost of production. Then we will find out if there would be any opening stock of finished goods and a closing stock of finished goods, it would be added and deducted from the cost of productions, and we will identify the answer, the cost of production of a goods sold. Then we will identify the sales and distribution expenses which are incurred in the respected company would be added into the cost of production of a goods sold, and it would be the answer, that is total cost. And the end of that, the total cost would be compared with the sales value, and the difference between the cost value and the sales value, it is your profitability or maybe losses. So in that way the whole structure has been actually identified and would be compared with the question, whichever the item would be recorded in the respected head will first determine that, and on the basis of that we will try to resolve and solve the problem. So now we will see how the questions and problem can be solved out in the unit costing. Let us see this first problem of the unit costing. So as we discussed that for unit costing we will try to resolve the problems one by one according to the methods. Let us see, this is the first problem regarding the unit costing, and as we discussed the following data are collected from the Gujarat Limited for the year ending 31st March 2013. For this data we need to prepare a cost sheet for the specific period of time. And preparation for the cost sheet, we have a certain informations, we have a certain expenditures regarding the part of the cost sheet of a manufacturing company. So now here the whole questions, before we try to resolve and find out the solution of this question, we need to identify the expenditures to be recorded on respected heads or respected items. As we discussed, the items are, one is material consumed, then second is direct expenses, then third is factory expenditures, then office and administrative expenditures, and selling and distribution expenses. Now according to this bifurcations we need to identify which expenses are going to record under the which particular head. Suppose the opening stock of raw material, the opening stock of raw material would be recorded under the material consumed. Closing stock of raw material is also going to record under the material consumed. Purchases will be recorded under the material consumed. carriage inward and carriage outward. There are two items. One is carriage inward and the another is a carriage outward, which is here. So carriage inward is always a purchase expenses. It is always recorded under the material consumed, and carriage outward is always considered as a selling and distribution expense. Why the carriage outward under the selling and distribution expense? Because of the carriage outward is paid at the time of when you are selling a goods. So carriage outward, it's considered under the sales and distribution expenses. It would be recorded under the selling and distribution expenses. Then direct labor, it is a direct expenses, will be recorded under the second head, direct expenses. Indirect labor, any type of indirect expenditures would be recorded, either maybe a factory overheads, admin overheads, or a selling and distribution overheads. This would be recorded as per the instruction if it is given in the question, or if it is not given, it would be recorded under the factory overheads. Direct expenses, it is recorded under the direct expenses head. Factory rent, specifically given it's a factory rent, so it would be recorded under the heading of factory. Office rent, it is an admin expenses, it would be recorded under the administrative overheads. Salesman's salary, salesman's is required always on for the selling of goods. So salesman's would be considered under the selling and distribution expenses, so it would be recorded under the sales and distribution expenses. Indirect material, as I told you, any type of direct material would be recorded under the first head, material consumed, but indirect material, it is always recorded under the head of factory, admin, or of selling and distribution. This would be recorded under the heading of factory overheads. Depreciation of machinery, machinery is generally required in a factory, so it would be recorded under the heading of factory. Furniture, furniture may be required, most probably required in administrative, so it would be recorded under the admin. Office salary, it is an admin expenses. Other expenses, factory, it is recorded under the factory expenses. Other expenses, office, it is recorded under the admin expenditures. Remuneration to the manager, it is given separately for factory, for office, for sales. It means it is a completely overheads and would be recorded all the three overheads under the factory expenses, under the office expenses, and under the selling and distribution expenses as per the expenses specifically mentioned. Sales expenses very clearly given, it is a selling and distribution expenses. Carriage outward, as I already discussed. Income tax, income tax would not be recorded in the unit costing when you find out the cost sheet. Income tax, it's an item which are actually paid. We have find out the cost sheet and cost structure where the income tax is not to be considered because of it is a part of a tax which we are not assumed that the part of tax as at present. So income tax would not be recorded in the cost sheet. Sales, at last it would be recorded in the cost sheet. Now this is a question, and now as per the bifurcation of this question, we will try to resolve and find out the solution of the question as per the format which we already discussed in the last session. Let's see. Yes, now we'll resolve the problems of the unit costing regarding the first problem. So let's begin with the first problem, and the title of the cost sheet is cost sheet. It's a statement of cost sheet, rather statement of cost sheet of Gujarat Limited for the year ended 31st March 2013. The cost sheet format that we will already discuss in the last lecture, if you remember. Still, if you can have it this format with you at the time of the solution of the problems. At present, we have a very simple problem. So we just prepared the particulars and 2 columns for amount. The 2 columns for amount in that way, the first column which would be considered, it's an internal column and inner column where the any amount of expenditures we have under the respected head would be recorded under the first column, and the total of that first column would be transferred into the next and outer column. So here this first item is, that is material consumed. As we already discussed, material consumed in the cost sheet, this first item, and we will identify the how much amount of raw material consumed for the manufacturing of this product would be recorded under this head. So we were already discussed in the part of that. The first is opening stock of raw material. Let's begin with the first item, that is opening stock of raw material, and that amount of opening stock of raw material is 33,000 rupees. Then added the purchase of raw material, if you have any purchase of raw material during the process. The purchase of raw material add into the opening stock of raw material, the amount is 1,24,500. Then the next item is if you have any purchase expenses, add the purchase expenses. We have a purchase expenses. If you remember, I told you there are two types of carriage. One is carriage inward and the other is carriage outward. So the carriage inward and carriage outward, two items. The carriage inward would be recorded here under the heading of a material consumed, and it would be added into this particular total. So now the carriage outward amount is 6,750. Then if you have any amount of the next item is that is return of raw materials. If the raw material is not as per the mark or as per the sample, the raw material would be returned back to the store or maybe returned back to the supplier, and it would be deducted from this particular total. But in this question we do not have a return of a raw material, so it would not be considered here. And then the make a total of this value, the total amount of this, it would be considered, and after the total of this, that is 1,64,250 less closing stock of raw material, and the closing stock of raw material would be deducted from this, that is 54,000 rupees. $54,000 of closing stock of raw material would be deducted from the 1,64,250. Your net value is 1,10,250 rupees. That is your first answer. The 1,10,250 rupees, it's your first answer. That is the cost of raw material, cost of raw material consumed. Cost of raw material consumed, that is your first answer. Now here the 1,10,250, it's your first answer. After that we will find out the value of the prime cost, and the prime cost you can determine when the direct expenditures are going to add in this cost of raw material consumed. So the second thing is we will find out the amount of expenditure to be added in the cost of raw material consumed. That is how it would be determined. As we already find out, the 1,10,250 rupees, that is material consumed, it's your first answer, raw material consumed. Under this we will add the second item, that is direct expenses, direct expenses. So now the direct expenses, we will find out the one by one. First is direct labor. Just see the question, direct labor we have 1,08,000 rupees, that you can directly record it in outer column. We do not have a many more item under this head, so direct labor directly you can record it in outer column. The second, if you have a many more direct expenses, that you can find out the direct expenses. See the question, in the direct expenses also we have the certain amount that is 24,000 rupees. So direct expenses is also going to record under the second head, 24,000 rupees. In all, we do not have any more direct expenses so far under this same head. So it would be recorded and added into the raw material consumed, both this item, and then the make a total of this, that is your second answer, your answer 2, that is prime cost, that is prime cost. The total of this that is 2,42,250 rupees. 2,42,250 rupees, that is your second answer, it is a prime cost. Now here, as we already discussed the format, in the format there are certain partition. The first is material consumed, which we already determined, then we find out the direct expenses, and the direct expenses, all the direct expenses added into the material consumed, and we find out this, the second answer, it is a prime cost. Now moving to the next part, that is factory expenses. see how the factory expenses can be determined. As we already find out, B prime cost, that is 2,42,250. Now add the third item, that is factory overheads. Any factory expenses which we have, that factory expenses would be recorded under the heading of the part of factory expenses. Now see the question. In this factory expenses, or in the question, we will identify the how many factory expenses are there. One by one, let's see the factory expenses. First is the indirect labor. The first item is indirect labor. We have a more than one expense, so all these expenditures are going to record in a first column, in the inner column, that is 21,000 rupees. After indirect labor, see the next thing and the question, that is factory rent. It is also a part of a factory expense, so it would be recorded in the under the heading of factory overheads, and the factory rent is given in the question, that is 10,500 rupees. See the next item in the question identified, which is actually regarding the factory expense. It is indirect material. Indirect material, it's given 600 rupees. So 600 rupees indirect material also recorded under the factory overheads. The next item, we have a depreciation on machinery. As I already mentioned, the machinery is generally used in factory. So the depreciation on machinery, it's considered a factory expense, would be recorded under the factory overheads. The amount of depreciation of machinery is 2,400. Next item is other expenses into bracket factory, which is clearly given, that is 9,000 rupees. It is also recorded under the heading factory expenses, 9,000 rupees. Then one more item, remuneration to manager. Remuneration to manager, actually there are three items mentioned, which is related to a factory, office and sales, but we will have to consider only the factory expenses here. So remuneration to manager, related to a factory, that is 7,500 rupees, recorded under the heading of factory expenses. See the question, any more items are related to the factory overheads is remaining? No. So far as factory expenses is concerned, all the factory expenses which are given in the questions are recorded already in the factory overheads. Now make a total of this factory overheads and transfer into the outer column. The total amount of factory overhead, it comes to 51,000 rupees. And this 51,000 rupees is ultimately added into a prime cost, and total it comes to 2,93,250. It is 2,93,250, and that is your answer number 3. It is work cost. This is your answer number 3, it is work cost. So far is concerned of the question which we were already discussed up to the work cost, where we already discussed the material consumed, then the direct expenses and the factory expenses. All these factory expenses are already added into the prime cost, and the total it comes to 2,93,250. Now moving to the next part, and that is administrative overheads. All administrative expenses now identified. We already identified administrative overheads, and it is going to record under the administrative overheads. Now after the work cost is identified, moving to the next part, that is administrative overheads. As we already find out the answer, that is work cost is 2,93,250. Then the next expenses is administrative overhead, it is item number 4, admin or office expenses. As we already identified the admin and office expenses from the questions, one by one we will take it and record it under the admin expenses. First is office rent. And the office rent amount is rupees 1800. Now the next item is depreciation on furniture, 300 rupees. The depreciation on furniture, generally furniture used in office, so that is why it is considered the depreciation on furniture recorded under the office expenses. Then the office salary, which is clearly mentioned, the salary of the employee to be paid who are working in the office. So it is naturally expense under the office expenses or under the admin expenses, which is 3,300 rupees. Then the next item is other expenses, which are very clearly related to the office, 1,500 rupees. And office expenses is rupees 1,500 recorded under the office overheads. One more item, remuneration to manager, and remuneration to manager very clearly mentioned for office. That means the manager who are working in the office, salary paid or remuneration paid to those managers who are working in the office, that is 10,500 rupees, but natural it is recorded under the office expense because of it is considered as an admin expense and office expense. So ultimately, so far as concern of admin and office expenses, these are the expenses which you can easily identify and determine. These are the expenses which are recorded on the office expenses because of the office rent. It is but natural paid paid for the particular building which are actually used for the office. Depreciation on furniture, but naturally the furniture which are actually occupied and available in the office, and depreciation would be charged on this furniture would be considered under the office expense. Office salary, but natural the people who are working in the office or the employees who are working in the office, paid salary to those employee would be considered under the admin expenses. Specifically mentioned as an office expense, it is also considered under the office expense. And at last, remuneration paid to the manager, which is also considered under the office expense. Now make a total of this and transfer into the outer column. The total amount of these expenditures, which comes to 17,400, and the 17,400 rupees would be added into the work cost. It comes to 3,10,650. And that is your answer next, that is cost of production. Cost of production. So in this way, your next answer is identified, the cost of production. We already find out the 4 answers. First is material consumed, second is prime cost, third is work cost, and the last answer is so far as till the question is resolved, the cost of production. Now after the cost of production, if you have a opening stock and closing stock of a finished goods would be added and deducted from this cost of production, will be find out the cost of production of goods sold. But in this question, as we already identified, we don't have a opening stock of finished goods and closing stock of finished goods. So we will directly move the last part of the question, that is the selling and distribution expenses. Now see the question, we have a selling and distribution expenses which are actually related to this question. Okay, now we'll move the next part, and that is last part of this question. As we already find out the cost of production so far. Fine, as we already find out, the last answer is cost of production. And the amount of the cost of production is, that is 3,10,650. As I mentioned, we have a last item, we don't have an opening stock of finished goods and closing stock of finished goods. So directly we'll add a first, next item is selling and distribution expenses. Under the head of selling and distribution expenses, now all of you see the question and identified the selling and distribution expenses from this question. The first item is salesman's salary. The salesman's salary is ₹3,600. Then the next item is remuneration to manager, which are related to a department of sales. Remuneration to manager, and it is regarding the sales department. That amount comes to ₹9,000. The next item is sales expenses, which is very clear, would be recorded under this head, and the sales expenses comes to ₹6,300. One more item, carriage outward. Carriage outward is also related to selling and distribution expenses. It comes to selling and distribution expenses, and the amount is ₹1,800. So these are the 4 items regarding the selling and distribution expenses would be recorded under the head, and the total of the selling and distribution expenses transferred into the outer column, which comes to ₹20,700. This 20,700 will be added into the cost of production. The total comes to ₹3,31,350, and the total of this, it is the another answer, which is last answer, total cost. This is your total cost so far as manufacturing is concerned and the process is concerned. Whatever the amount of expenditure is actually incurred regarding the manufacturing of this product, it is 3,31,350. Now we will compare this cost with the final value, and that is your sales. The sales is already given in the question. See the question, the sales value, it comes to ₹3,90,000. It means that the ₹3,90,000 sales value, which is higher than the total cost, it shows that the sales is higher than the total cost, which comes to a profit. The profit is the difference between cost and sales. It is ₹58,650. ₹58,650. That is your profit, and that is your answer. Here it shows that the difference between the cost value and the sales value, whatever the difference it comes, it is your profit or loss. Here the sales is higher than the cost, and that is why it comes a profit. So in this way the whole cost sheet has been resolved, which we actually find out in a different 4 parts. The part 1 is material consumed, part 2 is prime cost, then the work cost, admin cost, and that last is sales, the selling and distribution expenses is concerned, and this is the way to determine the cost sheet. So we will actually identify the cost sheet in this way. I'll show the relevance how the properly you can actually describe and deliver the amount of cost sheet at the time of the question solution. We'll see it. So this is the way you can actually find out the solution. The cost sheet of the statement of cost sheet of Gujarat Limited for the year ended 31st March 2013. See here, the first part is material consumed. At the end of the material consumed, all the items is recorded in the respected heads. The first answer is the cost of material consumed. Then the direct expenses to be added into the cost of material consumed. You find out the second answer, that is your prime cost. Then moving to the next part, which you can actually determine all the factory expenses. Under the head of factory expenses, all expenditures are recorded under the factory overheads in the first column. The total of the factory expenses of ₹51,000 transferred into outer column, added into a prime cost, which comes to a work cost, and the work cost is so and so amount. At the end of work cost, which we can identify the administrative overheads added into the work cost, will actually determine the part of the total amount of cost of production, and the cost of production at end with the selling and distribution expenses, we can determine the part of total cost, and the total cost would be compared with the sales. The difference, it's called the profit. In this question we have a profit because of here you can see that the sales is the higher value than the total cost, and that is why the profit we determine. This is what end of the first question so far is the problem of cost sheet. Thank you.
स्वाध्याय टीव्ही